All right, good morning. I'd like to wrap up the sessions this morning with an exploration and kind of pulling together some very important threads in our industry, in both the internet and business. And this is cloud computing, enterprise 2.0, and service-oriented architecture. Now, so I know how much or what we can talk about. How many of you are primarily technical in nature? Good. I would expect like that at this kind of conference. Many of you will know me. I write for ZDNet. We published Web 2.0 architectures last year, but I'm an enterprise guy. I've spent 20 years building really big systems to do really difficult things, and we used to always look down at PCs and the internet and the web. But now, we hear all the time, my website is bigger than your enterprise, and where the innovation is coming from is no longer from the business world, but it's coming primarily from the consumer world. And that is driving change in a way that's very uncomfortable for many organizations. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about these converging models of open computing, because that's really the big thread. If you're talking about the top-level construct, about what's really happening is that the web, that pervasive connection to everyone practically in the world, there's about 1.5 billion people, everyone in the developed world, and soon another billion in the developing world, we're all connected together all the time. And we're only just now beginning to get glimmers of what we can actually do with that. And so I'm going to explore how these threads are connected, what we're seeing, how they can drive forward what we're able to achieve, and then wrap up by looking at some very interesting trends that kind of show where this is going, where the value is. Because at the end of the day, we have things like cloud computing, which I'm not going to try and define, enterprise 2.0, which I think I need to define, and service-oriented architecture, which most of us don't really pay attention to anymore, except that seems to be most of what we actually do. The other two are on the uptake. So I'm going to try and connect these together because there are extremely important connections to how we engage in IT and how we run our businesses. So a lot of change is happening in business and IT today. And it's this whole push versus pull thing that we were just talking about. It's like the Soviet 5-year plan. We try and do everything ourselves in the IT department, or we develop the software. And of course, in open source, we learned that lesson first. But if we look at the stack of businesses today, we're being impacted by brand new development models, everything from Rails and Scala, productivity-oriented platforms, and open APIs, and many new exciting things. We'll talk about mashups in a little bit. We have cloud computing, SOA, open APIs, SaaS, which is delivering whole apps through the cloud. All of these are impacting the way that we deliver technology to people and what we can accomplish and what happens to the data. The data implications are really the most far-reaching. As we know, we learned that lesson 5 years ago with data as the new Intel Inside. That's what powers our software. That's what powers our websites. That's what powers our businesses. And now we have this thing called Enterprise 2.0, which I'll try and describe, but let's start with SOA. Service-oriented architecture. It was how we thought we were going to connect everything together. We have all of these silos we've been building in our industry for 30 years. We had these open web technologies. They were just beginning. We didn't have very much experience with them. We decided we were going to connect everything together. This was how we were going to do it. I'm going to explore how we did it in the enterprise, and then how the web figured out how to make it really work. Along this whole line of thinking is, we have walked through this short history of software. And of course, we went through the structured era and then the object-oriented era in the 80s and the early 90s and say, all right, well, the systems of systems that we're starting to see, all of our networks being connected together, that's killing us. We need a way that actually works. Objects don't scale, even though that's what we develop with our regular software, at the subsystem level, at the individual line of code level. At the data level, even, objects are what we do, but how we design in the very large, the systems of systems of systems, which most of our applications are now today, we intended to solve with service-oriented architecture. And we now seem to be moving beyond that, and it's something that there is not really a good name for. We're starting to call web-oriented architecture, and we'll explore that as essentially where we seem to have ended up after all of this. So SOA was the Legos that were supposed to solve all of our interoperability problems. We can connect everything together. We can build applications out of applications. That's something we do on the web all the time. It's still something that we find very difficult and time-consuming to do in the traditional world of software. Yet 80% of organizations, as of this year, are reporting that's what they're using. They're using SOA principles, maybe not the technology, maybe not the vendors, But saying, there's nothing beyond that. We haven't seen any other way of doing it. We're still doing that, but we're still maybe not delivering on what we'd like to see. But open standards were perceived as being extremely important, just like they were with cloud computing. So the lessons of the 2000s, of the last 10 years of struggling with web technologies, with APIs and web services to deliver value, is that it must have reach. What we've learned is we're really good at developing software and services and APIs. Where we seem to be having the problem is getting them to people to the point of use where it actually matters. And what we think we've achieved with the web is how to do this. And if you're wondering in your organizations, is this really important? Yes, CIOs are beating down the door of IT saying, hey, in this new, highly, deeply integrated and convergent world where we have these very, very long supply chains and we have so many channels, this channel fragmentation where all of these mobile devices, internally, just inside companies, you have fragmented IT challenges with mergers and acquisitions. Half of CIOs are saying this is an absolutely urgent need. We've got to connect. But we all know that integration is usually the biggest expense when it comes to delivering on any kind of large IT initiative. Integration is the largest cost. Yet, we see this business case very clearly from a very different way. Most of you are familiar with the story of Amazon. Many of you may not have seen this graph. This is directly from them. This shows this is the latest data that they've really made available, and they don't really want to talk about what's working so well. Beyond this is that we've been focusing on applications and point solutions, especially in enterprises, for a long time. We're trying to solve a specific problem, whereas on the web and in the cloud, we've long since moved beyond apps, and we think primarily about platforms. That's where the big value is. That's where the order of magnitude, or maybe several orders of magnitude of value comes from. And we can see here that bandwidth consumed by Amazon's global websites was eclipsed by bandwidth consumed by Amazon Web Services. And you can see the exponential difference. The network effect, as we like to call it, is substantially higher when we build a platform that says, no, we're not going to be on a single place or a few points of light on the web. We're going to be in 50,000, or in Amazon's case, over 300,000 different other places. Our supply chain, our cloud will be integrated into everything, and we get value out of every piece of that flow. This is the new economic picture for software, for services, for the internet, as most of us know. I spoke to the Twitter API lead most recently, to Alex Payne, to get the layest picture. They're the next Facebook. They believe that they're on target to be able to at least achieve the current numbers that they're seeing, which is 500 million users. Yet most of the use of Twitter doesn't come from the Twitter website. It comes from other applications that their various partners and suppliers have built. And this is the cloud. This is the future of the cloud, where we have these very, very distributed and federated products. So the strategic goal at the highest level of SOA was turning applications into platforms. That was the mantra. That's what we learned 5 years ago with Web 2.0. A platform beats an application every time. Exposing the features of software and getting partners excited about it and interested in it and motivated it because you had something special. There was a reason why certain APIs are used a great deal and others less so, although if you look at sites like Programmable Web and see who's out there, the thousands of APIs, all of them are getting uptake. And it's a new way, it's a new digital business model. And this is the hardest part we see with traditional organizations that look at their business in a very 20th century way. It's not paving the cow path. It's not rewriting the brochure onto your website. It's about creating fundamentally new businesses based on the capabilities of what you have, what data and what services you have, and so on. So one of the questions I like to pose is, how do we best think about our clouds? Which are now, SOA is realizing, or the technologies that the web came up with are really realizing a great deal of it. Is it about the services and the data, or is it about the business models around it? If you look at a World Bank, Best Buy, these are very traditional organizations. They now have full-blown developer networks in scale. Many other traditional organizations do too. And this is one way of really thinking about this, is we see the developer network wrapped around traditional businesses. Looks strange to us, even if we're inside the industry, but this is really what we're seeing. this is how we turn our businesses into platforms. This is the new cloud. So I do a lot of research and thinking in this area. I've been in SOA since it started. But there's a great deal of commonalities. We're actually talking about different faces of the same object. If you look at things like software as services and applications as platforms, trying to drive unintended uses, because that's where the value it comes from. It's not from the first use of that cloud API you've created. It's from the 100 or 1,000 reuses by all the partners that you may have, whether that's a horizontal cloud service like storage or that's a vertical service like credit card processing. Your job is to drive unintended uses and to make it as easily as consumable as possible. Of course, that's what we wanted in SOA, but it's actually what we achieved on the web. The web has been a runaway success. Every major web product has an API and a developer network. They understand this is how you distribute in the cloud today. So, but they were similar, but the focus was different. Really, one was much more about creating services. The other one was about how do we drive consumption? How do we make sure what we have in that service is the best, the most valuable? Because in an era where the world is flat, people can vote with their feet and with a URL, plug in a new API. So what happened to SOA, service-oriented architecture? Even though we're all claiming, if you look at the surveys, we're all claiming that we're doing it. We're seeing very low rates of adoption, high single digits, low double digits. Failure to drive the business conversation. That's one of the things that SOA never really did. It says, hey, we know how to connect stuff together, but we don't really think about how to re-architect the way that we do business digitally in all these different new cloud channels. And the technical approaches seem to have the wrong focus. We'll talk a little bit about that, because the web found better ways. If you look at that Amazon graph, I could show you many other graphs just like it if we had time. And so the world of SOA and Web 2.0 has kind of converged into this thing that, if you talk to a lot of the folks out in the web industry, we're kind of calling web-oriented architecture because we don't have another name for it. One has very granular services based on links that are all connected. One has very monolithic services. One's focused on consumption. One's focused on producing services. But most websites use web-oriented architecture approaches today, and most cloud computing platforms as well. If you want to see the most amazing API ever, take a look at what Sun has done with their API for their cloud computing platform. It's a work of art, and it's entirely REST-based. It's all link structure. If you know HTTP, you know how to use it. And it works in any platform, programming language, framework, toolkit, library that knows how to speak HTTP. That's the only thing you need to know. It aligns naturally with the grain of the web. And that's really what we've learned, is services and data work much better when they align naturally with the grain of the web. And enterprises are catching up. We see now the latest surveys, the last 12 months have shown that we're seeing a lot of interest. This is the primary model now that enterprises are finally beginning to adopt. So data as hypertext. And one of the interesting things about the web is that it's the largest living laboratory we have for software and for ideas and for innovation. And what we see is we've solved the distribution problem. We've figured out the ways to get it out there and to drive consumption of what we have. That is literally nothing more. All of our data and the entire data model is nothing but links and pages, if you will. Data, linked data, of course. So what we've learned is that the cloud is our global service-oriented architecture. There's a full spectrum of what we would call services. And it's everything that exists. Anything that's pullable via HTTP is a cloud service, like it or not. Even a web page is a cloud service. But that's not necessarily, that unstructured information in HTML is not necessarily what the interesting part is, although entire businesses have been formed around making sense of that, like Google. It's the services head that is particularly interesting to us, where the web APIs are, where we're figuring out where the infrastructure is, where the vertical service is. And again, we're now seeing brand new emerging models on how to distribute services. And I'll talk about that as we finish. But the services continuum, we're now understanding that everything that we can pull via HTTP is part of the cloud. So all these ideas are allowing us to create our own clouds. Open APIs and web-oriented architecture have informed the best approach to SOA. That battle seems to finally have been won. And cloud computing, that's standard. That's everything I just said, that's how we generally do. Not everything, but that's generally how we do cloud computing. But there's a new scenario. This is where we start to talk about the other threads in our conversation. that is creeping into our organizations, and this is data explosion. Because, of course, we encountered this with the web, right? Instantly, when everything was visible that we created, all the information was out there on the cloud, it became a major management issue. You know, Yahoo created the directories at first, and Google said, no, search is how we're going to be able to sort through it. And, of course, now we have even other mechanisms. And given that the visual web is soon going to be eclipsed by the non-visual services cloudy web, if it hasn't already, for most of us, in fact, we're going to have this same issue because we're creating this whole microcosm inside our organizations in the enterprise data cloud. And this is really the challenge of what we call Enterprise 2.0. So for this audience, I would define that as it's the application of user-generated web technologies to create a web-oriented data ecosystem. That's what we're trying to do. Now, most people aren't going to understand what that means. Some people in this room probably do. But if I was talking to my CIO, I would say, oh, it's using social web technologies to improve collaboration and data sharing. And we're going to get very specific about what we mean and why this drives the cloud and why it connects to the cloud and SOA. But open communication, shared knowledge, making sure anyone can participate, that's very important. Fundamentally web-oriented and emergent and free form. Those last two pieces are very, very important. That almost none of these things work well when they're overly focused on too specific a problem. They can be applied to almost anything. Just to be a checkpoint about how much things are changing right now. Right now, technology is accelerating away from the rate of change of the business world. There's this growing gap, and I don't know what's going to happen. This is what all the books are now these days, is what are we going to do about this growing gap? Centralized bureaucratic organizations can't keep up with the pace of innovation out there. What's going to happen is there's going to be some dislocation, disruption. We don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be interesting to watch for sure. But the social web now is the dominant model for communication, except maybe text messages. It really depends on whose data you use. But this data is about a year old. This shows how the number of global users of social communication has eclipsed email. And the key point here is email is not based on the architecture of the World Wide Web, but most of the social web is. So you look at communications going fundamentally web-oriented in terms of link structure and how the data is connected and how we locate it and parse through it. All the APIs that access it, all of that is now in a format that aligns with where the cloud is going and is what we're going to be using in terms of communication in the future. This is just the beginning of the trend. And most organizations aren't ready for this. Although I was just in Europe and I was presenting after Siemens, Siemens globally is throwing out email and going social. Their own problem is figuring out how to do social across the firewall, have the email gateway to everyone who still uses a legacy email. But this is the way people are already starting to think, and it's faster than most of our organizations can deal with. This is part of the challenge. So this is Andrew McAfee's checklist. If you're doing Enterprise 2.0, you've got to do these things essentially. And they're very web-oriented, notice. And this has held up very well over the last 5 years that the Enterprise 2.0 community has been validating this. Search is absolutely paramount. If you can't find the data that you have on the network, you don't have it. Linking, that's how we determine what information is valuable and what's not. It's how search works, in fact. Encouraging billions of deep links, not just on the web, but inside your organization. Hundreds of millions a year need to be formed for you to have a healthy data ecosystem, a healthy cloud in your organization. But most of us aren't quite there yet. On the web, though, that's what we've been doing from the very beginning. Making sure everyone can get information in that ecosystem, that's authorship. Tagging, that's how we deal with the organization in scale. We did that on the web, but all of the case studies I've been involved in, tagging has been instrumental in dealing with a scale, that data explosion that we're talking about in our internal clouds. And then extensions and signals, which for time we don't have to go with, but I encourage you to look at. So where we're headed, though, is this peer-produced intranet, this healthy web-based ecosystem where we can use the applications of our own choice. I'm going to try and give you some examples if we have time, of how we can use this to create the data and the applications that we need in order to be competitive and connect to the greater cloud as well. And do this alongside traditional enterprise systems which are running the business today. Just to keep you up on the latest part of the conversation, though, Enterprise 2.0 and all of this convergence is being, by some, including myself, talked about in a framework that we're starting to call social business, where the customers in the rest of the world, your business partners, and your workers have to somehow all be connected. We don't actually have a word for it, and a lot of people have floated that term, but I did want to socialize that. But your IT department and your organization is going to look at things much more monolithically. They're not ready to have this highly web-oriented, every piece of data has an address, every service has a URL, right? Every endpoint is all based on these technologies. It's very easy, a relatively simple, flat structure where everything is findable. I can even find data via my search engine. I can even find services via my search engine if I know where to look for them. Unfortunately, our enterprises are far too complex for that. This is of all the typical high-level moving parts in a modern enterprise around data. You know, you have the archiving and the auditing and the search and the visualization and the business intelligence and all the things that people want you to have in that context. And we've got to somehow break away from that. We need governance and security, but it's going to be the world that we're moving into right now is going to be much, much, much more federated. And the applications of the web already do that today, and those same pieces of software, or at least the same models, are moving into the enterprise. But we're going to have to help our organizations understand that. That's going to be one of the biggest roles is education, because the enterprise isn't the web, as you well know. We want to replicate the positive aspects of the large cloud, right? That's the dominant IT system in the world today. But we got to figure out how to adapt and how to augment our systems. I think what JP said in the last session really gives you some of the intellectual firepower to start thinking about how to do it. But the real issue is going to be this, and we see this with talking with Jive Software. They find that customers that have had these types of tools deployed throughout their organization for a couple of years are encountering this exact progression we see here, where you have this information exposure. Suddenly, what everyone is doing and all the data people have and all the projects and documents and all the information and apps that they're using are suddenly visible inside their organization. And they're like, wow, how am I going to deal with this? You know, it's like Clay Shirky said, it's not information overload that's the problem. We want the information. It's filter failure. So most of the vast repositories of data in enterprises, something like 80-some-odd percent, 90% in some organizations like government, is just not accessible in any practical manner. Yet we pay a fortune to keep it around and use it once in certain applications as opposed to making real use of it the way that we do on the web, which is get it out there to everyone who needs it. Enterprise 2.0 is changing that. I cite a lot of figures and facts and figures, and they're all backed up if you want to see me afterwards. But about 50% of organizations globally have Enterprise 2.0 in some significant way. Those are Global 2000 companies, right? So web and web-oriented based cloud infrastructure will create this visible surface area. And we got this explosion I have there on the diagram. But the next phase is going to be, all right, now how do we deal with it? All the silos are actually being torn down. Finally, these tools naturally do that. They link everything together. They connect everything together. All of your services can be easily connected together. You know, a little bit of glue, you know, in your favorite scripting language can pull together systems around the world. I do demos all the time for web-oriented architecture APIs, build amazingly powerful applications using Rails in just a few minutes, using APIs from all over the place. That's just the way the world works now. But the visible surface area causes a huge management issue. Who's going to administer that? Right? That's what I hear. The IT department says, oh yeah, who's going to support that? We don't have the answer to that, but the answer is probably not the way we're doing it today. One emergent solution is mashups. We've been talking about that for 5-6 years. The web's been doing this for a long time, but they're just now starting to get into businesses in a real way. But it's really about saying, all right, well, in any organization, there's maybe a few hundred developers, and there's maybe a few thousand IT people, and maybe 5 or 10 or 100,000 of everyone else. Right? Where is the productive capacity? Where is the ideas coming from? Well, they're going to come from that whole spectrum. How do we get the tools? And this is where this concept of participation comes in. Authorship needs to be in everyone's hand. So I think a really important example will really highlight what we're seeing out there. The story I'm about to tell you is by just regular line people. There may be slightly power users, but at a government crisis center I worked with a couple of years ago, they were using email to communicate the information that was coming in from any new crisis. They'd create an email list, put like 500 people on it, and then you got spammed, whether you wanted that information or not. So to solve that problem, because there were so many complaints, they created a blog for each new crisis, a new blog site. And the newest information was always at the top, and then below that was the information. If you wanted to, you could subscribe to it with a feed reader. It was great, except it wasn't connected to their enterprise data. They wanted, for example, to put the latest satellite imagery, animations, different JPEG slices coming in from the satellite system. So they went, well, how do we do that? Well, they'd heard about widgets, so they went and they got from the web a little JPEG animator, and they copied and pasted that into the blog post and fed the URLs to the image server. And lo and behold, they could say, hey, we've got new satellite imagery, here it is, go and look at it, not knowing that they had just wired together two parts of their system. These very free-form and emergent social platforms are natural integration points. Cut and paste integration goes away. You're actually using these social tools to knit together things. And we can spend time talking about how it solves search and how it solves data organization. Putting that authorship ability in everyone's hands to keep the cloud tidy and neat and organized really works, because it works in a much bigger example that we all use every day. So they had a similar problem that calls come into the call center. They didn't have time to transcribe it. Sometimes it would be half an hour or hours later where critical information came in, and by the time the blog post came out, it was too old. So they got an MP3 player widget and copied that in to a blog post, connected that to the URL of the MP3 file on the call center server, and people would say an urgent new call came in about so-and-so, click the play button to listen to it. And there they are, knitting together using web technologies, very lightweight, not even realizing what they're doing. And I'm hearing the story going, oh my God. What you're doing would normally require a development team and testers, and someone have to figure out how to build an application to do just what you need. Well, with today's tools, you generally don't need that. We still need all that old IT for certain things, but not a whole lot of things as it's really turning out. And this sort of user-generated concept where we have a lot more control than we think we did, and because we've now refined the complexity. Civilization advances when things that were hard were made simple, and this is what cloud technologies are doing. They're making things that were formerly very hard much simpler. So the mashup story is very exciting. We're seeing it growing into the enterprise now, being situated in the workplace. But what's really exciting, the latest trend to wrap this session up, is app stores. This really seems to be another way that the web, and things that are connected to the web but not quite the web. Apple really drove this concept to major success, to such a great success that now everyone is copying them. But it's not really the web. It's connected to the web, but it's their own ecosystem. I would like to point that out. But it's a very easy way, as a trusted conduit of not just software, but also we're seeing now services and data. Enterprise app stores have now emerged from IBM, has Smart Market. It's all cloud-based. It's all appliance-enabled, and anyone can plug their applications, their services into it, and participate in Smart Market. Google has their own enterprise apps marketplace. Programmable Web has done this for services for a long time, but it's a modern distribution method to bring whatever it is, maybe mashups. This is what we're really going to talk about. The enterprise app store is how SOA initiatives, how people who have external or internal cloud services, they can provision them and let people self-serve. Right now in the rest of the world, we're already learning. Whatever we need to do, there's an app for that. And that same aha moment is now happening in the enterprise. It's like, well, we don't have that way to solve problems. We should be able to solve our challenges in the same exact way. We should be able to go to our app store and get the services and the data that we need to solve the problem at hand. And that seems to be the next big thing that's coming. I don't have enough data yet to support that, but that is a trend where we have most of the major vendors starting to make plans around it. So I'll wrap up on this last slide here. How to embrace this cloudy world of Enterprise 2.0 and SOA. There's some simple rules. If you don't get these wrong, you won't hurt yourself. There's other things you're going to do too, though. But whatever you do, don't break the way the web works. That's what makes all the things I just described possible. Do put the whole data ecosystem into the hands of everyone. Self-service is the most powerful force we have. It's what made open source work, right? Why this conference is here. It's made Web 2.0 work, and Facebook, and YouTube, and Wikipedia, and many other things that we can talk about from a more serious business perspective. Don't make it difficult to reverse decisions about your cloud technology. The standards aren't there yet. It's very, very hard to start doing this in the enterprise even today, which is why it's, of all the things I'm talking about, the least done. And apply enterprise requirements on top of web models for data. We can't just transplant consumer cloud to the enterprise, but security, audit, and archiving, if you give them the appropriate attention, you'll get the respect you need to get it done. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me right before lunch.